Okay. Okay. Just continue with the situation where we open for international trade. We are now allowing this this country and the United States to trade with Japan in this motorcycle market. And Japan is now the panel on the right-hand side there. It's I just need a pointer. Which was not there. Okay. It's a low-cost producer. The supply curve for producing motorcycles are much lower than for the US. The US has this sharply rising supply curve. This is flatter and it starts lower. The demand for motorcycles are not that high in terms of willingness to pay per unit. We see here that it starts on a level slightly above 1,000, and it's more elastic. The slope of the line is not that high, so it's more elastic. So the willingness to pay for bikes here are lower. So the question is, how will this equilibrium turn out to be? In the domestic market in Japan, before the trade is opened, is 50,000 bikes per year, but at a price of only $700 per unit. So it's a totally different market. The panel in the middle here is the production or the market for imports from Japan. So it starts on 700, and that is the market equilibrium price in Japan. And this is the demand curve for imports. So what we see here is that, and it's the market, it's the demand for imports from the US in this case. So we see that it starts on a price equal to 2,000. And it goes down, downwards, as demand curves normally do. And given the supply curve or the production cost curve for bikes in Japan, the equilibrium price here will be 1,000 here. So this is the demand for bikes from the US, equal to 50,000. If you have trade, and I have to just say one thing, in this stylized framework, we don't include transport costs. We could have done that, but for the sake of simplicity, we have ignored the transport costs. So the world is, in this case, frictionless, but it don't affect the main points here. But what we see is that there is a demand from the US for bikes cheaper than $2,000 down to a certain level. And that demand will be met with products from Japan to a given price, and the equilibrium is where supply equals, or the willingness to pay equals the production costs. And here it happens to be at $1,000. So 50,000 bikes will be imported to the US. The market price in the US will fall to 1,000. And as transport planners, we now know that opening of this market creates a movement of 50,000 units per year from Japan to the US. This is a very micro situation, but you can imagine a large market that is opened. And you can foresee that it has interest for planning of transport capacity. But this has some implications, of course, in these two markets. One is that the price drops in the US. This is the demand curve. So when the price drops to 1,000, the demand increases from 40,000 to 65,000. And of course, if you are very fond of economic analysis, you could also see here that there is a potential for analyzing the slope of this demand curve. In this case, it is rather inelastic, meaning that it is not very price sensitive. I mean, halving the price and increasing the demand with from 40 to 65 is a very price inelastic demand structure. But we don't care too much about that now. The point is that allowing for trade lowers prices, increases demand. But there is another important consequence of this. And what is that? In this market. Do you see that? Demand increases. This. We have imports from Japan. What happens in the domestic market? Apart from the increased demand. Do you see that? If you were Harley Davidson or whoever produces bikes in the US, what happens to them? This is a supply curve for motorbikes. They used to sell 40, and now they only get 1,000. They have to close down a bit of their production, not to say most of its production, because the domestic business or the domestic industry, for manufacturing industry for motorbikes, they get a demand of 15,000 out of this. That is what this industry can produce to cover their costs. The rest is imported from Japan. So 25,000 bikes is sort of not demanded anymore from this domestic producer. Whereas the consumers, they get cheaper products, larger quantity. The producers get lower paid, have to reduce production. In some cases that may not be too dramatic, because they may be, I mean, the market may be big and still. But other industries, like for instance the Norwegian textile industry or the Norwegian industry for cell phones, which were actually a very successful business 30 years ago, they vanished almost overnight. I mean, it took a few years, but not that many years, just because of this kind of mechanism, like this. And you can also imagine if this domestic industry needs to reduce with more than 50% of their production, that has also impacts for their suppliers again and local communities and everything. So the producer surplus in the American market is reduced from this large triangle, which has a value equal to 2,000 times 40, 2,000 minus 400 divided by 2 times 40. That is the producer surplus as it used to be, minus 1,000 minus 400, 600 times 15 divided by 2. So if you subtract the large triangle, the small triangle from the large triangle, you get the reduction in producer surplus, which is quite large. So they are left with some 90 millions or something in producer surplus, and they used to have much more. Whereas the producer surplus increases with this area. This area is the increase in consumer surplus. So you have an increase in consumer surplus, which is an increase in welfare for the consumers. And you have a decrease in producer surplus for the producers in America, in the US. And the net gain from trade is equal to this triangle. And by applying the numbers, it should say 400 here. You can calculate all the numbers, all the effects here. So, in the US, producers suffer, consumers gain, and the net gain from trade is equal to this triangle. This is an added value for the American society in economic terms. In Japan, it's different. Because here, because of the increased demand from the US, because we have lifted the trade barrier, the prices go up from 700 to 1,000. The producer surplus used to be this area. 700 minus, I think it's 300, times 50 divided by 2. Now, because of the increased demand, they produce more, get a higher price. So the new producer surplus will be equal to this, 1,000 minus 300 times 75 divided by 2. So they gain quite a lot. The producers, they gain this area. This trapezoid here is the gain for the producers. But the consumers here, which used to pay 700, demanded 50,000, they had a consumer surplus equal to this area, this triangle here. But then the prices goes up to 1,000. Because of the elastic demand, which is just an example here, it's a very elastic demand. You see that the demand is only half of what it used to be, 25 instead of 50, because of this price increase. So they are only left with this consumer surplus. So they lose this area. So what is the result? What is the outcome of this? Is that the producers gain this trapezoid, which is a gain for them. The consumers, they lose this area. So again, we are left with this triangle here as the net gain of trade, also for Japan. But it's not the consumers that gain, it's the producers. The consumers are worse off than they used to be. So when we are talking about, when you see in the newspapers that we should not introduce trade barriers, and when countries are maybe they are defending the trade barriers, they want the trade barriers to be there. They may want that to protect their domestic industry, like the US in this case. There has been some trade wars going on between Japan and the US, especially within the car industry, because it was the same there. Other countries, they may want to lift trade barriers because they gain from it, in terms of getting more profits for the industry. So it depends on the position that each player have or has here to see how they will act in terms of negotiating conditions for trade. But what you observe here is that it has impacts on export and import flows between countries, and the conditions may be quite pronounced for some products and for some countries. This international competition may, as I said, be fair and okay, and no big deal for the trade partners if they are in a reasonable balance at the outset. But if you have a country, a high-cost country, with a small manufacturing industry, which are suddenly subjected to competition from a low-cost producer, the consequences for the high-cost country may actually be quite severe. They may lose most of its industry. You have heard about boycotts. Nowadays we are talking about there is a lot of attention towards Syria, and how should we deal with the situation in Syria? And somebody had said that, well, we need to introduce some kind of boycott, right? When we had the apartheid regime in Africa, the steel industry was boycotted. So they didn't get any steel from anywhere else, so they needed to start their own production. So South Africa started their own steel production. Looked something like this. High costs, reasonably high demand, because of the boycott. And then, when it was 93, I think, the boycott was lifted. And everybody was happy, at least in the short run. But what happened was that the steel industry in other countries produced on a cost level like this. So when the boycott was lifted, the whole steel industry, most of the steel industry in South Africa went bankrupt. So we can also use trade theory to sort of examine the effects of introducing boycotts, because when boycotts are lifted and the domestic industry is exposed to competition, they may get severe problems. And I've been to South Africa and I've seen the areas in Transvaal, where they had the steel mines and the steel production. And it's not a very pleasant, let's say, situation that they are in now, with a lot of bankruptcy taking place during the last 20 years because of this. So this illustration it's good to sort of understand thoroughly what this is actually saying, and to be able to discuss it in let's say on some occasion, a couple of months from now. I think it's important to understand the dynamics of trade. This is telling what I have just said, so I'll not spend more time on that. You can do the calculations yourself. It's not too difficult, just to get the numbers from the slides and do it. And we see here the effects of trade. The rest of the world, I have called it Japan, but it's the rest of the world. The right-hand panel on the previous slide. So price in the US goes down, quantity supplied by the domestic industry goes down, quantity demanded goes up. Whereas it's the other way around for the rest of the world, or Japan, as I have called it here. I've talked about the welfare effects from trade. And what happens. You can read that in the article, but the welfare effects is basically what I've told you about the effects for the producers and the consumers in each country, where consumers gain, producers lose in high cost, and the other way around in low cost. A Swedish economist called Gunnar Myrdal wrote in 1957, he wrote a book called The Economic Theory of Underdeveloped Regions. He didn't develop this formal, let's say, analytical framework, but he said, based on empirical observations, that it is very important when two countries are going to trade with each other, that they are fairly balanced in terms of economic power, to avoid situations like this where one player may lose a lot if the production industry or the manufacturing industry is going to shut down, is had to shut down because of bankruptcy. And this also summarizes. So if you compare that table with the letters in the various areas here, you can follow the reasoning quite easily. And this is actually the same situation, but I have illustrated it in a slightly different way. And here I am talking about what will happen if you change the level of transport costs between two trade partners. If the transport costs are reduced, what will happen with the balance of trade between two trade partners? You recognize this one. It's the same as I showed you as Japan or the rest of the world, if you like, the low-cost producer with demand and supply at a sort of lower level than the high-cost producer. The difference here is that I have used the vertical axis as a common axis for both. And then to combine, I needed to flip this high-cost illustration 180 degrees. So here, demand has to be read from right to left, like this, and supply increasing like this. But it is the same concept, a high cost and a low cost producer, I've just flipped the left panel 180 degrees. So the point of departure is the same. You have an equilibrium here where demand equals supply. You get a price, a unit price. The same here. Equilibrium there, unit price much lower, and the demanded quantity in the domestic market is equal to this level in the low-cost country and this level in the high-cost country. And the level of transport costs was equal to T120 in this case, where this equilibrium and this equilibrium. And then transport costs are reduced to T12, this level. So you see the difference between that length of the arrow and this length of the arrow. The difference is a reduction in transport costs. It means that when you reduce transport costs, you get easier access to cheaper products. And in this case, you get a new equilibrium here, where you have a higher price, you have a higher demand for products from the low-cost country, and here you import, you reduce the price, you reduce also the here the demand for domestic products, and you increase demand in total. And the price is lowered from here to here. In the low-cost country, the price increases from here to here. But the difference is the transport costs. So the same situation appears. The gains from trade in the low-cost country is this triangle. The gain for the producer is this trapezoid. The loss for the consumers is this trapezoid, and we get this as a net gain. And you have the same situation, but only the other way around in the high-cost country, where demand increases. You have a gain for the consumers, and you have a loss here for the producers, because the demand for domestic production is reduced. And the net gain is A2, B2, E2 here for the high-cost country. And you have the same distribution of wealth, where you have the producers as the winners in low cost and the consumers as the winners in high-cost countries. So, of course, when you reduce transport costs, that is not as dramatic as sort of starting a new era where you allow for trade between two countries. But it can be quite important if you manage to reduce costs, if you have information about the supply situation, the supply curve, and the demand curves in each country, and that's what market analysts are actually doing. They are trying to say something about the elasticity of demand in various markets, and they also monitor the supply side, the production costs in each of the markets. And then you can actually at least come as quite close to an estimate about what this will mean in terms of increased flows of commodities between these two countries. It's a tedious work, of course, to do all this analytical stuff. But I mean, that is what the World Bank and the United Nations and others are doing to try to say something about causes and effects of certain actions. Do you understand this? The article by Linnert and Poole is quite clear. It's not. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's quite easy and to study the graphs and study the numbers and the various letters and try to work out how this works in theory. And I mean, I've referred to a couple of examples of practical of events from the real world, like lifting of boycotts, introducing, let's say, free trade unions, which has the increased flow of commodities as one of the main objectives. And what we are actually, if we go one step further down in this, let's say, in this discussion, or up, if you like, we can focus on the supply curves here. You see that the supply curve in one country is much lower than the other. And what does that mean? If we think in terms of economics or logistics, operations management. What it means, if you assume here that we are talking about homogeneous products, it's the same product, in essence, it's the same product, is that this country is much more productive than this one in producing the same goods. So if you see, let's say, if you see the globe as one unit, you would like to produce where you can make the best use of the available resources. And the shape of the supply curves and the level, the production cost level, gives you some information about productivity in various markets, which of course can be discussed in light of political science and equity and not too nice exploitation of cheap labor and all that, which is also part of this discussion on free trade. But if again you have met this criterion on fairly balanced, that two fairly balanced players are trading with each other. The differences in productivity makes it you add value by trading with the country that can produce at lower costs. And when I talk about balance, it might then be that the high-cost country is a low-cost producer when it comes to other types of goods, and then you have a very the ideal situation is a very balanced trade flow with different products. It may be the other way around for a different product. Yeah. So, and this goes together with this Heckscher-Ohlin theory. Two Swedes came up with this one. They are advocating that countries export where they have their competitive advantage. They can use their factors intensively and read them in a more productive way than their trade partner. whereas they import the products that is too expensive to produce by themselves. Then they can use those resources on more productive, let's say, activities. To be very extreme, and to take a very extreme point of view here, you could then convert people from producing motorcycles with very high costs to produce, let's say, healthcare services or anything else. So it's a matter of getting a better match between activities in terms of maximizing productivity. So that is a very shorthand version of the Hexagon theory. That the countries are using their available resources in a productive way, and trade may actually aid or assist in achieving the objective of using resources in the most productive way. You see here, this is an example of labor and capital, which is sort of the same as motorcycles and healthcare. The example. So, why does country trade? Why do countries trade? Demand and supply conditions differ, and prices differ. Gains from selling products in markets with higher willingness to pay for the low-cost producer, and gains also for the producers of the low-cost countries in selling the same products. You have the welfare effects, which are important. Well-being and the distribution of wealth is also a very important aspects when we discuss free trade or international trade. What we also see is that free trade causes more transport. There are much more transportation going on. There has been some shifts in international transport that we can trace back to the lifting of trade barriers. You have the EU in Europe, with the intra-European movements have been very much stronger. You have the movements between the US and Latin America through trade agreements there between Canada and the US. There are activities going on in Asia to establish trade unions and so on. And the objective is to reduce the barriers and to gain from that. So this is the purpose of this lecture has been to offer a backdrop from what we are going to spend the rest of the time on this in this course on, namely to discuss transportation. But I think it's good for you to have some idea of the mechanisms that actually causes all these transport activities to take place. So I will see you again in a couple of weeks, I think, and then Harald Gjelle will take the lectures for the 2 coming weeks. Thank you.